Blessings, everyone. I hope you're doing well wherever you may find yourselves. I'm Dane, your host. I hope you're enjoying this holiday season. Today's video is the top 15 most important bands of all time. This is just my take on it, so it's completely subjective. I'd like to weigh in on what I think is an important discussion. And I do need to lay down a few disclaimers or parameters so we're on the same page. Some of these bands that I will mention are in my top 50 or my top 25 favorite bands of all time, even my top 10. I've done a video on my top 10 favorite bands of all time. However, some of these bands I'm not the biggest fan of, but I have to give credit where credit is due. So there are 2 or 3 of these, maybe 4. So for some of these bands, I'm just a casual fan. I may like some of their stuff. I may not like all their discography, or I like, a small section of their discography, that kind of thing. So just wanted to point that out. Now, in addition, when I talk about certain bands here, or all the bands here, I'm going to point out many of the bands that they've influenced or inspired. And some of those bands that I'll mention that were inspired by one of the top 15 may not be a band I like, but I have to include them because they may be a band that you like. So I have to put that in there. I think it's very important. And finally, this is not a ranking with respect to number 1 is my favorite band of all time, that kind of thing. So number 1 through 15 is definitely just a ranking about most important. And by that I mean because they were innovators, they were so inspirational for other bands and upcoming musicians and fans alike, that kind of thing. So influential, and they were pioneers. So those are the big 4: pioneers, influence, inspirational, innovative, and of course innovative and pioneers is the music part, which is the most important. So again, if number 1 is this band, that doesn't mean it's my favorite. It means I recognize them as the most important band of all time because of those 4 things. Okay, let's get started. Number 15. This is one of those bands I have to give credit where credit is due. I am not in love with this band. I'm a casual fan, and I'm talking about the Velvet Underground. Now, here are a list of the many genres or subgenres within the rock purview that the Velvet Underground has gone on to inspire and influence and be the starting point perhaps for, or the jumping pad or launch pad for these subgenres to begin, or to downright, you could argue the Velvet Underground is not totally responsible for these subgenres, but played a big role in creating these subgenres. All right, art rock, punk, garage rock, shoegaze, goth, indie, alternative, and glam. And in addition to that, the Velvet Underground also influenced and contributed to art in general, and that's very important. Now, here are some of the artists and bands that the Velvet Underground influenced and inspired: David Bowie, Iggy Pop. Keep in mind, Lou Reed, of course, was in the Velvet Underground, and when it comes to this ethos, the Holy Trinity is considered Bowie, Pop, and, of course, Lou Reed. So Bowie, Iggy Pop, Sonic Youth, REM, the Jesus and Mary Chain, the Pixies, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Mott the Hoople, the Modern Lovers, Brian Eno, New York Dolls, Patti Smith, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, Joy Division, Violent Femmes, and Television, to name a few. So, as you know, Lou Reed goes on to have pretty much a very good, illustrious solo career. There are some snoozers in his discography, like Metal Machine Music. I know the purist will argue that that's a masterpiece, but let's face it, that was created to get out of his contract with RCA, I believe. Don't quote me on that. His very first solo album, there's a little left to be desired, but with the second album, things start to get going. You have wonderful albums like Berlin and the live stuff, right? So it's just Lou Reed continues where the Velvet Underground left off. In many ways, of course, he goes off and touches upon things that the Velvet Underground did not. And so the whole connection to Andy Warhol has a lot to do with their influence on the music scene at the time and for generations to come and for art in general. Okay, so 15, the Velvet Underground. Next, number 14 is the Stooges. Now, I'm going to do a little sidebar here because the sidebar or tangent is actually connected to why I've included the Stooges as one of the top 15 most important bands of all time. So, most people will agree, or rather, many people will agree, that punk begins in 1964 with the Kinks' release of You Really Got Me. Okay? And then, of course, you have The Who, in some ways, influential on the punk scene because of songs like My Generation with the smashing of guitars and that kind of thing. There's a certain punk ethos to that song, and of course the attitude with the breaking, of the guitars and the amps and that kind of thing. But it's more about the music, of course, because Ritchie Blackmore did that with, later on, not much later on, but with, putting his guitar headstock into the speaker amps and that kind of thing. But anyway, so 1964, maybe the beginning of punk, if not definitely proto-punk. But it really gets going in 1966 or 1967 in the United Kingdom and also on the West Coast in California in the United States at the same time because of two bands. In 1965, you have the band The Sonics, and across the pond in the United Kingdom, you have a band called The Syndicate, also 1965, which included future Yes guitarist Steve Howe. And so in anthropology and or archaeology, when you have something that's invented or created and both parties aren't aware of it, it's called independent invention. And so you could argue that proto-punk really gets going in 1965 because of the Sonics with their hit Strychnine, and then quite a few releases from the Syndicate in 1965. Now, and then it really blossoms in 66 through 67. There are a lot of garage rock bands on the West Coast in California in the mid to late 60s. And of course, quite a few bands I'm going to mention in the United Kingdom also riding this new wave, if you will, that is proto-punk. Now, I will argue that 1965 is the true origin of proto-punk because while the Kinks has that flavor of proto-punk, that song still has some pop features to it. When you get to 65 with the Sonics and the Syndicate in the United Kingdom, again, I'm going to connect this to the Stooges. There's still an element of pop to it, but it's more gritty and heavier than the Kinks song, even though the Kinks has some of that. So let's talk. I'm not going to mention any more garage bands from the West Coast because I think it's the Sonics that really get it going. And there are others, of course. There's a book called The Oral History of Grunge, and in that book, the first chapter talks about the Sonics being the first proto-grunge band. So, and of course, there's a connection between grunge and punk, very similar aesthetic and that sort of thing, and attitude, and of course the music as well. So if we go to the United Kingdom, 1966 to 1967, including the Syndicate with Steve Howe, you have bands like The Voice, Wimple Witch, Alan Pound's Get Rich, The Buzz, The Riot Squad. What's interesting about The Riot Squad, you have David Bowie, that's right, on vocals for about a year. You also have Mitch Mitchell, who goes on to be in the Jimi Hendrix Experience. I don't know if he was in the band at the same time as Bowie. And then you have a couple more bands, The Game, Him and the Others. You have The Wheels, and this is a UK band, but it has Van Morrison in it, so Irish. And they had that hit song, Bad Little Woman, which goes on to be covered by another band in this era whose name eludes me. You also have The Seeds. Check them out. They're quite good. The Missing Links, and then you have The In Crowd, which also had Steve Howe, future guitar player of Yes, which changed their name to Tomorrow. So my point here is that in 1965, through 1967, you have these proto-punk bands. But I think the Stooges is where it really solidifies this movement. Because if you listen to the Stooges, whether deliberate or not, I think it's deliberate, you can hear elements of the Wheels and the Seeds and the Missing Links and the Syndicate and all those bands I mentioned, and the Sonics as well. So I think the Stooges are where they solidified that sound. And they rode, I don't want to say they stood on the shoulders of giants, because these bands are not the most popular, but they stood on the shoulders of these proto-punk bands, and they made it their own, but took the elements of that, made it their own, and it really launched from there. And you have bands like the MC5 jumping in and that kind of thing. So essentially what I'm saying is that the Stooges solidified or cemented what was going on before them in 1969 with their first album, The Stooges. And what they did was they looked at those bands and brought it to their music, brought it to the table, and all of this, right, paved the way. All of that music, the 65 through 67, paved the way for the Stooges to arrive. And then they would pay it forward. And what I mean by that is continue that influence from those 65 to 67 UK and American garage bands. So here are the bands that they paid it forward to, bands that were influenced by the Stooges: the Misfits, the Ramones, Mudhoney, Pere Ubu, Ride, Sonic Youth, Jesus and Mary Chain, Blondie, Joan Jett, Kurt Cobain, and Slash, to name a few. And notice I mentioned a couple bands like Sonic Youth and Jesus and Mary Chain that were also influenced by the Velvet Underground. So there's a connection between the Velvet Underground and the Stooges. And these are the twin or complementary bands that are so influential on the rock scene in general, and of course proto-punk as well, to name a few. So there you have it. Number 14 is the Stooges. Number 13 is Kiss. Now, they are not the first to be a band with a gimmick, but because you had, before Kiss, you had Alice Cooper and you had the New York Dolls, and of course Kiss was influenced by them. They're essentially contemporaries of Alice Cooper, but Alice Cooper had the makeup first. But Kiss really took what they saw from Alice Cooper and the New York Dolls and really ran with it, right? Next to the Beatles, they're the most marketable band of all time with respect to merchandise, with, T-shirts and keychains and, fan clubs, and you had the Kiss Army, right? The lunch boxes, right? All that kind of stuff. So types of rock that Kiss influenced, because they were part of these subgenres themselves: glam, shock rock, again, Alice Cooper. Gimmick bands to come, they would foreshadow because of the gimmicky: Slipknot, Gwar, Ghost, Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson. And then you have other bands, the face-painted metal bands, with the corpse paint, right? King Diamond, Mayhem, early Celtic Frost, Dimmu Borgir, Gorgoroth, and Immortal. Now, looks aside, you have bands like Venom, Motley Crue, Ghost Again, Pantera, Poison, Twisted Sister, and the hair metal movement, essentially. Would the hair metal movement been what it had been, or at all, were it not for Kiss? Who knows? But Kiss, widely influential from an aesthetically costume point of view, and the music as well, because let's face it, there is a heaviness to Kiss, and of course, bands like King Diamond take, in comparison, Kiss is not heavy compared to, say, King Diamond and Mayhem and Celtic Frost and whatever, but still inspirational, still influential, look and music-wise. And of course, Kiss aspiring musicians to play overall, for young kids to pick up an instrument. One of the things critics have pointed out is that one of the downfalls of Kiss perhaps was that you have, such a large fan base, by the time Alive 1 comes out, young children involved in the Kiss Army. And, if you listen to the lyrics of Kiss, very, sexual innuendo and that kind of thing. If my mom only knew, some of the lyrics on Rock and Roll Over, she probably would not have let me have that album my grandfather bought for me, my first Kiss album, after Alive, first studio Kiss album. But putting that aside, you have, myself included, rather, if I continue in that vein, I started listening to Kiss when I was in 3rd grade, 9 years old. And my mom, every time a new Kiss album came out, it'd be waiting for me when I came home from school on my pillow. Kind of like a musical tooth fairy, if you will. But I digress a bit, but it's important to point that out. You have kids coming in, making Kiss even huge, and as those kids grow up, becoming adults and passing it on to their kids. So there's a good and bad with, kids, young kids being influenced by Kiss, but it's so influential because, you have these, as I said, these young children growing up and wanting to pick up a guitar or a bass or sing or play the drums and, face paint and all that. And of course, we have to talk about Ace Frehley. Wildly influential for those of us who like heavy guitar, the pentatonic scale, the showmanship with the smoke out of his Gibson. Just Ace, so important for the band because of the he's part of that heavier side of the band, right? And when Unmasked was done, Ace was like, we gotta go back to our roots and do something heavy. Of course, they didn't do that because Paul and Gene decided let's do what the Who did and do a concept album, and we know how that went, right? And it's unfortunate that Ace, while in the video, is not on the album for Creatures of the Night, their heavier comeback album. So, got to include Kiss here as number 13. Number 12 was Van Halen. So influential on guitarists, especially chasing that brown sound, as critic Martin Popoff and others have pointed out. The finger tapping, let's talk about that. There are like 26, 30 guitarists who came before Eddie Van Halen who were finger tapping. One of them, of course, Steve Hackett of Genesis. But what Eddie did with the finger tapping is made it even more popular. He took something that was, there in the ether, if you will, or, people knew about it, but Eddie just made it amazingly so popular because of how he did it. Not what he did, that's part of it, but how he did it, his approach to it. All is, very unique, right? And because of that, Eddie influenced so many guitarists to come. Tony McAlpine, Paul Gilbert, Marty Freeman, the Shrapnel guitarist, right? Jason Becker, Vinnie Moore, Richie Kotzen, Joey Tafola, David T. Chastain. If you're not familiar with Chastain, I suggest you look into that catalog. Some wonderful stuff there. Now, the big four, of course, that were influenced by Eddie, and they've gone on record saying this, are Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen, and, of course, Eric Johnson. And, of course, Van Halen, definitely influential on the hair metal scene, along with Kiss. David Lee Roth's presence is part of that, the long hair, the mane, that beautiful mane he had, right? What a great head of hair he had back in the day. Made a lot of guys jealous, including myself, because, and of course I grew my hair out long at one point and had it long for a long time, but it wasn't as, wonderful as David's. But, so attracting the female audience, that kind of thing. So Van Halen, very influential. And of course, Alex Van Halen is a very underappreciated drummer, I think. A lot of people talk about him, but I don't think enough people do. He's definitely one of the, I would say, top 40 drummers of all time. I'm not sure where I'd put him. He wouldn't be in my top 10 or 15, but I would say probably my top 25. And what can we say about, that hasn't been said about already, about Michael Anthony? Like Alex, he's an underappreciated bass player. Next time you put on a Van Halen record, don't tune out Eddie's guitar, but focus on the bass, and you'll see what I mean if you have not done that already. So Van Halen, number 12. Number 11 is Pink Floyd. Of all the acid, art, psychedelic, mixed with prog bands there are, and there are quite a few, this is the top-notch band of them all. People will argue Moody Blues did this first, and you would be partially right with the prog part of it, but not the acid and the art. The psychedelic you'd be right too, Moody Blues, right? But maybe I'd have to look at a timeline now that I think of it. I don't want to say something that's incorrect. Correct me in the comments, please. who did it first. Was it Pink Floyd or Moody Blues? I think it's Moody Blues, but I think they're a little bit earlier. But regardless of that, Pink Floyd, inspirational to so many musicians, fans, critics alike. And one of the elements, in addition to the acid and the psychedelic and the art and the trippy, and the prog, is the concept pieces, right? Inspiring bands like Queensryche and Voivod, King Crimson even, Porcupine Tree, Tame Impala, Yes too, Radiohead, Iron Maiden, and of course David Gilmour. Albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, The Wall, and Wish You Were Here, those are the big four in their catalog, really is where you become, or I'm sorry, I don't want to speak for others, where I become totally impressed with David Gilmour as a guitarist. I love his stuff earlier on, but this is where he cements himself as one of the rock gods in the rock god pantheon of guitar players. Blues and psychedelic, of course, have to throw that in there. Think about that. Pink Floyd is known for their acidy type music, art rock, psychedelic, prog, blues. You almost have it all, right? And they've even inspired the band has even inspired heavy metal. Many a heavy metal artist has been inspired by David Gilmour's playing. And, of course, the love of their craft that goes with that. Now, we have to talk about the Syd Barrett era, of course, because while the first album is very psychedelic and experimental because of songs like Interstellar Overdrive, I'm not one of these people necessarily to call Syd Barrett a genius, but I would say he's approaching genius or was approaching genius because there isn't enough body of work, including his solo albums, the 2 or 3 that we have, right? But I would say he's approaching genius. What could have been type of thing, right? And regardless of whether you like Syd Barrett or David Gilmour more is beside the point, I think, because starting with that first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, through and including The Wall, I like parts of the final cut, but that's where it's at. Even the soundtrack stuff is inspirational, I think. I know a lot of people don't like it, but the stuff on the tracks on the Zabriskie Point soundtrack and the stuff on the title track for Obscured by Clouds is, I think, amazing. Careful with that axe, Eugene, which is called something else on one of the other soundtracks, is just phenomenal. So that's kind of the impetus for people who like heavy metal to jump on the Pink Floyd bandwagon. You have 2 singers. You have the wonderful, aesthetically pleasing, soft-spoken vocals of Gilmour, and then you get the little rough and edginess that you get out of Waters at time that also has inspired many a heavy metal artist. And I think while Gilmour gets all the attention in the band for being the guitarist that he is, and rightfully so, I think Waters sometimes doesn't get enough love as a bass player, and I think he's wonderful. So Pink Floyd, number 11. Number 10 is Motorhead. Most people who are Motorhead fans know the story about how Motorhead united the punks and the metalheads together, and that's one of the reasons they're in this list. There's quite a few videos out there. I just saw a new one where it's a YouTube short that someone posted from their Instagram account, and Lemmy's got his his brown Rickenbacker that's got like the etched in the wood. It's beautiful. It's of course a custom Rickenbacker. And he goes up, he plays some notes on his bass. He goes, "This is what a traditional bass player sounds like." Then he goes up to his amp and he tweaks a few knobs and he goes, "This is what I sound like." And it totally makes sense. And we know many of us know, because he was in Hawkwind, that he originally, coming from a band called, I think, Sam Gopal, or there was another band he was in, he was a guitar player. And he originally wanted to play guitar in Hawkwind, but they said, "No, you're going to play bass for us." And he kept that edginess. He plays the bass in many ways like a guitar. He's Billy Sheehan before Billy Sheehan, but he plays it all his own. He doesn't sound anything or much like Billy Sheehan at all, and vice versa. And that's good. So let's talk about some of the bands that Motorhead has influenced. Metallica is a big one, of course. Slayer, Megadeth, Guns N' Roses, Venom, Napalm Death. There's also a band called Asmovel, Asmovel, that looks so much like and sounds so much like Motorhead. Check them out if you can. And there's some lesser known bands like Overdose, White Spade, Speedwolf, Burning Leather, and this one's kind of not lesser known but not widely known either. Somewhere in the middle would be the band Midnight, and I think they're working on a new album. That trio has a Motorhead meets maybe King Diamond approach to heavy metal. Maybe that's not the best way to describe them. Did I mention Napalm Death? They were influenced by Motorhead. Many have gone on record saying, not me, but I get it, that perhaps Motorhead is the first extreme metal band of all time. But keep in mind, Lemmy has gone on record as to say that they're not a heavy metal band. We're just a hard rock band. Or actually, he just said, we're just a rock and roll band. Perhaps they're the first speed metal band because of that Overkill album with Filthy Animal Taylor's double bass. Other bands that they've influenced: Saxon, Judas Priest, Accept, Clutch is a huge one, Electric Wizard, Exodus, Overkill, Airborne, High on Fire, and two punk bands, Anti-Flag and the more popular of the two, The Exploited. So yeah, have to include Motorhead here, folks. Okay, number 9 is Metallica. And Metallica, for me personally, I only like the first 4 albums and half or 2/3 or maybe a third of the Black Album. Really called the Metallica album, right? But let's talk about the first 4 albums one at a time. There's nothing like that first debut album, one of the greatest debut albums of all time, Kill 'Em All. That is a pure thrash album, and I would argue it is the only pure thrash album by Metallica, because once you get to Ride the Lightning, it's a lot more polished. There's still some thrashy stuff on there, but you have more commercial songs like Escape and Trapped Under Ice. And I think James has gone on record as saying he doesn't care much for the song Escape. It's okay. So if we go back to Kill 'Em All, this is their heaviest record, still influential on the West Coast thrash scene. Okay, you have the East Coast stuff happening relatively at the same time with Anthrax. I think Nuclear Assault is New York too. Don't quote me on that. Post in the comments what part of the country they're from. That eludes me. But so many people my age going, have you heard this new band when this comes out? You know? And of course there are people who don't like it because it's too heavy, that kind of thing. Some of my friends made fun of me because, that kind of thing. And of course later on they jump on the bandwagon kind of thing. But this was unprecedented until this comes out. Who would have thought this would have been a thing? And of course, we owe it much to Lars Ulrich. Whether you like him or hate him is beside the point, because you listen to Metallica, and it's much, as he said, Lars did, that it's a fusion of the new wave of British heavy metal meets punk. And by punk, he means, the more gritty, edgy type West Coast California punk, not the British Big Four, like The Damned and The Clash and Buzzcocks and Big Five, rather. Sex Pistols and I'm missing one. Ramones. So, some of that's American. So, anyway, I may have misspoke, but are the Ramones American? I can't remember if they're American or British. Anyway, for some reason. So, the point is that this new combination of the new wave of British heavy metal meets heavy punk, hardcore punk. There's the word I was looking for. Your skate punk like DRI, Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, Suicidal Tendencies, that kind of thing. Not to knock the British Big Four, Big Five that I mentioned. Even though I'm not a big punk fan, I love The Damned, but Anyway, so you get that with Metallica's first album. More leaning towards, of course, the new wave of British heavy metal and the heavy, fast, focused stuff. But you get that also in that hardcore punk stuff. So, and then, of course, Ride the Lightning, as I said, it's a lot more polished because now they're on Electric Records. But you still have them keep going with the instrumental stuff, in this case, Call of Cthulhu, but more in the vein of a classical approach because the acoustic guitar, and it gets, light and shade, goes from acoustic to heavy, partially written by Dave Mustaine, I believe. And I say classical because of the return to, the song has a motif in it where you return to the main theme in the song, right? As opposed to Anesthesia Pulling Teeth, which is just Cliff Burton going into town with his effects pedals, right, kind of thing. It's more derivative of the times than it is looking back to a more orchestrated piece that is the Call of Cthulhu. So I think Call of Cthulhu, whether deliberate or not, has a classical feel to it. And of course, you have some heavy tracks like Creeping Death and the title track, and of course, you have that Light and Shade, Ride the Lightning beginning with an acoustic and then getting heavy, which makes it sound heavier, and that spills over onto Master of Puppets with Battery, acoustic intro, then it gets heavy. Disposable Heroes, really heavy, some epic tracks on Master of Puppets, which further inspires perhaps Injustice for All, because this is really where the band has a more orchestrated classical feel, a very progressive metal, right? A progressive metal or progressive thrash metal album, because you have these long extended tracks like Blackened and One and Eye of the Beholder and Shard of Straw. You have that progressive rock component to it, that stop start that from Rush, right? So that kind of stuff going on. And Injustice for All, these four albums are so different, and that's what's beautiful about it. You have the pure thrash album, Kill 'Em All, then you get a little bit more commercial, but still really kick-ass heavy. We're on a big label now, okay, you get it. Then you get Master of Puppets, which is like the combination of Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. It's still polished, still Electric Records, but a bit more return to that really hardcore thrash element with songs like Damage Incorporated and the other songs I mentioned. But you still have the instrumental in Orion, so it's much like Ride the Lightning, which that's a great song. And speaking of Rush, that jam session in the middle of Orion sounds a lot like it was influenced by that jam session in the middle piece of The Necromancer, where it's all instrumental and the three boys are just going to town, and it's so heavy. That's very Zeppelin-esque kind of too. And of course, then you get Injustice for All, as I said, very prog metal, extended pieces, very classical in that sense. But despite that, these four albums are the showcase, the best, despite the fact that these are the best four albums, and most people would agree to that. These were held by many to be the gold standard for thrash metal, inspiring, Dave Mustaine himself leaving and getting kicked out rather than forming Megadeth, and so many other heavy metal bands to come. Metallica were pioneers of their day. We had not heard anything like this before, and so despite the fact that they have a pretty big discography, not terribly huge like Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, or Judas Priest, but pretty long, could be longer, but these four are where it's at, and these four will remain to be so inspirational for generations to come. So Metallica, number 9. Number 8, Judas Priest. While Black Sabbath did it first, Judas Priest, I believe, took a cue from Black Sabbath and went from there. There are Judas Priest, part of the first wave of British heavy metal because of Sand Wings of Destiny. The whole album is not heavy metal, but you have Victim of Changes, which seems to be there. To me, Victim of Changes is very similar to Child in Time by Deep Purple because of the light and shade and the really high-pitched vocals that Halford has here. And of course, Halford also showing his baritone, the low register with songs like Epitaph. You have that light and shade that is quintessential to heavy metal because of Prelude with the piano going into Tyrant, right? and Sin After Sin, the last song, where it begins with the volume really low and it gets louder and louder, and then Halford goes into this really high-pitched kind of thing. It's just amazing. And then it gets, and then he starts singing the pre-chorus, right? Just an amazing song. Songs on Stay in Class. Much of this is heavy metal, not the whole album, but songs like Invader and Saints in Hell. Those are pure heavy metal songs, especially Saints in Hell. That's heavy. Exciter's pretty heavy. Beyond the Realms of Death, very Zeppelin-esque in the sense that you have this light and shade, this bouncing back and forth between acoustic and Halford being very soft, and then being really edgy and heavy and singing higher and more aggressive, right? And it's that back and forth, that to and fro. But it's really not into Screaming for Vengeance that you get Judas Priest really coming into their own as a pure heavy metal band, because later on you get Defenders of the Faith, which has been called Screaming for Vengeance too by many a critic and fan alike. Then you have a falling off with Turbo, but then you get back to the heaviness with Painkiller, and then there's more after that, of course. But Judas Priest, you could argue, very influential, I think, on the thrash metal scene because of the title track, Screaming for Vengeance, where you have, for the whole song now, not parts, Halford singing at the high register the whole way out, and it's very fast and furious. It's very thrash metal-like, along with Overkill's, the Overkill album by Motorhead. This and Screaming for Vengeance, very thrash metal-y, very influential. And Judas Priest, what I was going to say, and I'll say it now, is that it's really when you get Screaming for Vengeance that Judas Priest begins to dive into what we call power metal, because of the more heavier from what came before and that really high-pitched vocals. So it's thrash meets power metal. Perhaps influencing that first Pantera album with Phil Anselmo called power metal, and other power metal bands to come. So here are some bands that Judas Priest inspired. Queensryche, Fate's Warning, Blind Guardian, Helloween, perhaps Accept, Pantera, I just mentioned that first album with Anselmo, Metallica, of course, Megadeth, Slayer, especially Kerry King. Kerry King has gone on record saying he was very inspired by Judas Priest, and of course the band Primal Fear. How could they not be? Now, when it comes to a aesthetic wardrobe approach, if you read K.K. Downing's biography, Heavy Duty, he says that it was his idea that he brought to the band, hey, let's wear leather and studs, and Halford was all aboard on that. You have the motorcycle shtick with the Rob coming out on his motorcycle in many a live performance. I got the pleasure to see Judas Priest live just once, and only once, in whenever Defenders of the Faith came out, 84 or 86, and it was in Biloxi, and he came out on his bike underneath the Hellcat, right? It was great. You have the Funko Pop of him in his leather outfit with the hat and the whip, right, and the glasses. And, of course, perhaps inspiring bands like Saxon, Iron Maiden, Anthrax, and Destruction because of that leather belt with the fake diamond, half squares on it, whatever that's called, and the stud, that kind of thing. So also inspirational, influential from a wardrobe point of view, the denim and leather, the leather and the studs. So, and of course, what can you say about the theatricality of Judas Priest's live performance? And that's still going on today. If you look at Judas Priest live stuff from their recent tour, and even look at K.K. Downing's band, KK's Priest, does much of that. His band touring with the Sad Wings of Destiny cover behind the band is beautiful. Of course, Judas Priest inspiring Rob Halford in particular, inspiring K.K. Downing's bandmate, his lead singer, who was also in Judas Priest for 2 albums, right? Demolition and Jugulator, and Tim the Ripper Owens, so definitely an inspiration. We would not have Tim Ripper Owens and KK's Priest if it were not for Rob himself. And you have the rivalry between Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. I'm a big believer that Iron Maiden definitely wanting to compete with Judas Priest. That's pretty much a given. You could argue at times that Bruce Dickinson sounds like Halford, but not entirely. And that's, that's not on purpose. That's his genetics, of course, but it works really well. So theatricality is very important. And the twin guitar, so inspirational for other twin guitar bands to come. There are others in the past, like Thin Lizzy, that kind of thing, but twin guitar has to be an element here. So Judas Priest, definitely pioneers in their own right. Next is Deep Purple, number 7. Here are some bands they inspired: Def Leppard, Europe, Foreigner, Caius, Queens of the Stone Age, Nazareth, Queen, Quiet Riot, Van Halen, and UFO. Deep Purple, very influential on the heavy metal scene, though not a heavy metal band themselves, because of definitely proto-metal, because of the album In Rock and others, Machine Head, because of Ian Gillan's high vocal register that he does so well, and very unique sounding, and he incorporates a lot of that into many, as you know, Deep Purple records. But if we talk about David Coverdale, that blues-style heavy metal, albums like Burn and Stormbringer, those two specific title tracks are very proto-metal, inspiring many a metalhead and metal bands to come. And we have to talk about Blackmore. Blackmore's neoclassical style, he was classically trained, and it's been proven now. There's much evidence to show, there are YouTube videos on this too, where Blackmore took ideas from classical composers and put them into many a song, like Stormbringer, Burn, that he stole from classical composers, just putting it on Hammond organ and guitar instead. So transferring from instruments. So very important, because there is a connection, of course, between hard rock and blues and heavy metal, of course. So Deep Purple, have to give them the number 7 spot. So deserved of that. And of course, Coverdale in Purple, and then in his solo, and then Whitesnake, and then Whitesnake becoming a very hard rock blues based band, and then hair metal because of parts of Slide It In, Whitesnake 87, and Slip of the Tongue, and then those are the big 3, I guess, for Whitesnake being hair metal-y. So definitely influential on the hair metal scene or heavy metal scene in many ways, or both. Definitely one of the best proto-metal bands of all time. Deep Purple, number 7. Number 6 is Rush. This is a unique sounding band. That's how I got lulled into enjoying this band, and to this day, my favorite band of all time. But they're in the number 6 spot. So very unique sounding band. A blend of hard rock, progressive rock, early Cream style Led Zeppelin-esque blues, Jimi Hendrix-esque blues, okay, and proto-metal, heavy metal stylings in guitar solos. Think of the presentation part of 2112. Think again of that guitar wailings in the middle section of The Necromancer. There are so many. That's just 2, but there are so many. Limelight and Tom Sawyer, and there's just so many. Farewell to Kings, Xanadu. There's so many examples of Lifeson sounding like a heavy metal guitarist. Okay, so we'll come back around to the members of the band. So 2112, definitely inspiring heavy metal, not just because of Alex's guitar stylings, but because of Geddy Lee's high-pitched, unique style vocals, and the drums, of course, of Neil Peart, inspired by Keith Moon, of course, and others. Other albums, too, definitely inspiring heavy metal. Dream Theater is a band. Here's some bands and artists inspired by Rush: Dream Theater, Trenton Reznor, Billy Corgan, Porcupine Tree, specifically Steve Wilson, Kirk Hammett. Listen to that Orion solo on Master of Puppets, Damage Incorporated, and Injustice for All. Those songs, I hear a bit of Rush there. Much of Injustice for All, the album as well, I hear, because of that stop start with the drums, and of course what Hammett's playing, that kind of thing. Other bands and artists: Tool, Anthrax, Queensryche, Iron Maiden, specifically Steve Harris, Primus, Cliff Burton, and Dave Grohl. Now Rush is the best trio in my estimation, because one of the reasons why is because they use the space. When you're a trio, right? When you're a trio, there's not much space to work with because you have to compete with the drum kit that's, definitely going to step things up and invade space. Guitar player, of course. And what I mean is with respect to Geddy, because traditionally the bass player is the backbeat, the rhythm section, and on the back burner, so to speak. But Geddy doesn't do that. Geddy is up front and layering things with the drums and the guitar and competing with Alex and not competing with Alex. That kind of thing. That's the shtick of By Torn the Snow Dog and Free Will. That to and fro between the bass and guitar, much like Yes with in Heart of the Sunrise with Squire and Howe. So they use the space, despite the fact being limited as a trio. They fill it up with space, and they fill it up and beyond. They take the space that's there. It's like theater, right? They teach you when you take a theater class, use the space. Well, Rush has that in spades, as I said. And they're dedicated, hardworking. Of all the bands there are, this is number one, I think, when it comes to chemistry and synergy. And part of that is because of their friendship, despite the fact that Neil was the new guy, right? Their love of music, their love of the craft, hardworking, as I said, touring schedule, all that plays into their dedication to the music, and it shows in the songs themselves. The typical thing you read in the liner notes of a Rush album is what? Music by Lee and Lifeson, lyrics by Pert, right? Not always, but that's usually the run-of-the-mill, or the expectation is. So if we go back to Alex definitely influenced by Jimi Hendrix and especially Jimmy Page, and you can hear some Eric Clapton in Working Man, but he makes it his own. I would say that in addition to Alex being inspired by Jimmy Page and then making it its own and launching from there, is with albums like Caress of Steel and 2112. I mentioned this when I talked about the book about moving pictures, how Geddy, in that book it talks about how Geddy assumes the role of the characters in the story, like in 2112 and in Red Bar Chatter and so many others, Caress of Steel, Fountain of Lamnath, the character there. He is that character, right? But on top of that, what Alex does is he paints these beautiful soundtrack or these soundscapes to tie into what Geddy's role is. So there's that connection there. And that's why Rush is number 6 here, because of that. There's these blistering solos. So back to that. Like Jimmy Page, the 12-string guitar is so key that, although his is white, the double neck is so... I think it's almost as iconic as a Jimmy Page's reddish brown double neck. I would say that more iconic than that is, so I'll include it now, is Alex Lifeson's white Gibson, the ES335, I think it is, or ES336 that he uses for La Via Strangiato. It looks like a Gretsch, but it's a white Gibson. It's beautiful. And then tied to all this, all three members, is the diversity of their styles. They can play acoustic, they can play electric, heavy, they can play soft music, like pieces like the Poetic Madrigal, right? So you have prog, you have hard rock, you have folk, you have classical, you have just a broad palette. All the instrumentation, especially in the centerpiece of their prog era, which was, say, Fly By Night through and including Hemispheres. You have, if you read the liner notes of Farewell to Kings, you got Pert bringing in wood chimes and the glockenspiel and wood blocks and all these different things that he's adding to his kit. It's just amazing. Electronic drums coming later, where he's got drums in front of him, drum behind him. The only person that rivals Pert, perhaps with the largeness when it comes to drums, is perhaps Terry Bozzio. So, such a diverse band when it comes to music. Let's see. So, and then this is the jazz element, and specifically Geddy and Neil, the rhythm section having that jazz fusion-y type whether it's the solos or not the solos, just adding that element to it. And Alex doing his own thing. So you have that jazz combined with the blistering hard rock and heavy metal guitar that works so well. You have some wonderful instrumentation with YYZ and La Via Strangiato, as I mentioned, and of course others. The songwriting is diverse. The songwriting, mostly Neil, is very cerebral, influencing bands like Voivod and so many others. So, what a trio. We all know that, whether it's his words or not, it was what he was thinking. Pert joins the band for Fly By Night, and he goes, you know what, we're going to jazz things up a bit. And boy, did they, right? Literally and figuratively. So, Rush, number 6. Number 5 is the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Like the Stooges, you only have 3 albums, not counting the posthumously released stuff. But the larger question is, who wasn't influenced by Jimi Hendrix? K.K. Downing, in his book Heavy Duty, has gone on record to say that Hendrix was a huge inspiration to him wanting to play and playing the guitar. So here are artists and bands who were influenced by Hendrix. K.K. Downing, Prince and the Revolution, Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble, Lenny Kravitz, Jeff Beck, Robin Trower, Queens of the Stone Age, Eric Clapton, Johnny Lang, Kenny Wayne Shepherd, John Mayer, Gary Clark Jr., Gary Moore, Lemmy, after all, he's a roadie for Hendrix, right? Living Colour, The Cure, specifically Robert Smith, Tom Morello, Red Hot Chili Peppers, specifically John Frusciante, Zakk Wylde / Billy Gibbons, Kirk Hammett, and the band Muse. Part of the reason for Hendrix is very similar to Rush. You have limited space because you're a trio, and yet you use the whole spectrum of the palette. You use everything. You have that uni-vibe effects pedal that Hendrix was so known for. Hendrix's presence on stage and in the studio and his ability to inspire so many, you have to include him here. Such a precedent and such a pioneer in rock history. Teaming up with, other legends like Buddy Guy. I said live stuff, right? Band of Gypsies is phenomenal. Inspiring blues, inspiring rock, inspiring heavy metal as well. It's just a jumping pad for so many different subgenres of rock. So number 5, Jimi Hendrix. Number 4, definitely have to include them here. Not the biggest fan, but I do like much of their work, is the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones have gone, well, critics and fans alike have said that the Rolling Stones have inspired punk, and I would not disagree with that. There are little blips here and there where you could see the Rolling Stones, not just Jagger's swagger and his presence on stage, but the whole aesthetic of the Rolling Stones. There's a certain edginess and grit to the Rolling Stones in their heyday that inspired punk, I believe. And the attitude helps as well. So if we go back to albums like Out of Our Heads and December's Children, and the earlier stuff as well, the issue with the band is that their stuff was a mix of originals and covers. And of course, the Rolling Stones were always, in their heyday, a singles band, unlike Led Zeppelin. But they become, not overnight, but nearly overnight, it seems, they become an international success because of their singles outputs. But it's not until the album Aftermath, and there are 2 versions, the US and the UK. I like the UK better. You can just get the US stuff as singles, right? It's not until Aftermath comes out that you have the album. This album, rather, is where the Rolling Stones commit themselves to having all original compositions. This is where they commit themselves mostly to having all original compositions. This is the first album to consist entirely of original compositions. Now, later they do some more covers like Harlem Shuffle, which I love, and some other things, but then you get the wonderful Beggar's Banquet, the last album with Brian Jones on it. And I would argue that Beggar's Banquet, like so many of us, through and including It's Only Rock and Roll, is their best album run. Why is that? Well, because Beggar's Banquet is just phenomenal. You have them doing some unbelievable stuff, even inspiring heavy metal. if you hear me out, because of the because of the song Sympathy for the Devil. Okay? As you know, part of the gimmick of heavy metal is the devil or Satan or Lucifer or witchcraft and, getting a perspective of evil's point of view, that kind of thing. Not that I'm a big fan of that. But the song itself lends itself to, how humans are evil, the devil made me do it, that kind of thing. Anyway, so I don't want to run that into the ground, but you get my point. So yes, and I'm not the first person to say that song inspired generations to come with respect to heavier music and doing the gimmick of, look at Goat's Head Soup. That album cover insert with the goat in the soup is very inspirational for bands like Venom, and you could argue, right, that kind of thing, or Reverend Bizarre, or any band that has the goat's head, or Baphomet, Slayer, that kind of thing. Anyway, so, but that's a minor detail. So from Beggar's Banquet through It's Only Rock and Roll is their best run, but when you get to the follow-up to Beggar's Banquet, it's because of Mick Taylor. The Mick Taylor run from Let It Bleed through and including It's Only Rock and Roll is where it's at, in my opinion. You have some comeback albums in Some Girls and Tattoo, which I love, especially Some Girls. Tattoo, we all know now that most of that, if not all that, was stuff that they had previously done. So it's like a patchwork type of album, much in the same sense that much in the same way that Exile on Main Street was to some degree, and Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti. I even like parts of Emotional Rescue. I would argue that Emotional Rescue in many ways is to the Rolling Stones what Dynasty is to Kiss, and I'll leave it at that. There's some good stuff there. Bands that the Rolling Stones inspired. Chrissie Hynde, you can see an early photo of her carrying a copy of December's Children or 5 by 5 or one of those early albums. Aerosmith, and I'll explain very simply. We all know that Steven Tyler stole his look and stage presence from Jagger in some degree with the scarves on the mic and the way he plays with it, and people have argued his look. Well, he can't say his look was by design because that's genetics, but the big mouth kind of thing. But Aerosmith has been hailed by many critics, or panned by many critics, as the U.S. version of the Rolling Stones. Early stuff wise, I get it because of the blues based stuff. I love early Aerosmith, first album through and including Draw the Line. I'm not a big fan of Night in the Ruts, but I do like Rock in the Hard Place. All right, the White Stripes, the Black Crowes, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, the Stooges, New York Dolls, the Ramones, the Clash, Social Distortion, Primal Scream, the Stripes, Wilco, the Black Keys, Oasis, and the Verve, to name a few. The Rolling Stones are so important because they brought blues to the masses. Okay, The Who could have done more of that, but you don't have the bluesiness like you do in the Rolling Stones. The Who has songs like Young Man Blues, which is the guitar playing is so heavy there. I wish Pete had done more of that, but I'm not saying entirely that The Who didn't bring the blues to the masses, but the Rolling Stones really brought the blues to the masses, more so than Fleetwood Mac. All right, so massively influential. They brought, not only did they bring the blues to the masses, they brought the blues to America in spades. They were rebels. They influenced punk. They shaped U.S. culture in so many ways. They're so iconic. I mentioned Sympathy for the Devil. The showmanship of Jagger and company, especially Jagger, I would say. And they were innovators in their own right because of all the things that I mentioned. Sympathy for the Devil, their rebellious attitude, taking what was, like so many bands before them and with them, contemporaries, they took, like Led Zeppelin, they took blues invented by peoples of color in America, Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, you name it, even back to the 20s. And then bringing it way into the mainstream and commercial success. So Rolling Stones, number 4. Number 3 is Black Sabbath. As Martin Popoff has said in one of his books, they are the inventors of heavy metal. They're also the inventors, and I'm not the first person to say this. They invented doom metal because of their third and fourth album, Master of Reality and Volume 4, where they changed their tuning. Iommi is the grandfather of the riff, the heavy metal riff. He is the master of the heavy metal riff. But you also have the beauty of Bill Ward, a jazz drummer in a rock band. And yes, jazz metal is a thing, but when you combine the genius that is Iommi's master riffing and soloing with jazz-type drumming, the beautiful writing that is Geezer Butler's writing, which is incredible. He's one of the most memorable of bassists. There's just something undescribable but yet amazing and captivating about his tone. There is no other tone like Geezer. No one does Geezer Butler's bass like Geezer Butler. You can copy it. It's not going to sound the same. I think Ozzy's charisma, not the best vocalist, but that charisma, his presence on stage and in the studio, and his unique vocals, all combined with the other three members, makes Black Sabbath a force to be reckoned with. Such energy. If we talk about Dio for a minute, he brings that level of fantasy and magic and supernatural. Fate versus free will is the theme. Political corruption is the theme, with songs like Heaven and Hell. To a lesser degree, Tony Martin is very inspirational, especially on albums like Tear and Headless Cross. Not so much for me with the last album, Forbidden, but that album, Cross Purposes. There's some wonderful moments in that album. Bands that Black Sabbath inspired: Judas Priest, St. Vitus, Candlemass, Electric Wizard, Sleep, High on Fire, Guns N' Roses, Black Flag, Baroness, Iron Maiden, Ghost, the Melvins, of course the Melvins, Down, Body Count. Ice-T's going on record as saying that the idea for Body Count came about by combining rap, hardcore rap, with the guitar heaviness of Slayer and Black Sabbath. Black Label Society / Zakk Wylde, Metallica, In Trouble, to name a few. Pick any metal band. Pick any doom metal band. This is where it all began. You can't tell me you would not have had the bands that we have now, Judas Priest, St. Vitus, etc., had it not been for Iommi, Ward, Butler, and Ozzy. To some degree, Dio influences some power metal bands to come, like Blind Guardian, Demons and Wizards, you name it. The use of the tritone, all kind of things, right? So Black Sabbath, Iommi, just an inspiration to so many guitarists, Ward for so many drummers, Butler for so many bass players, and Ozzy for hair metal, and much more to come following in Ozzy's wake. All right, number 2, Led Zeppelin. If you read Hammer of the Gods, the author Davis talks about how witnessing young kids headbanging to Led Zeppelin live performance of Communication Breakdown says it all. Proto metal at its finest, songs like Communication Breakdown, that light and shade, right? We know the story, if you're a Led Zeppelin fan, about how Page put on Joan Baez's Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You for Plant, and he said, I want to do that light and shade. And then the rest is history. So inspiring other rock, hard rock, and heavy metal bands alike. Very blues-like, but different from Rolling Stones, making it super heavy, unlike the Rolling Stones for the 70s. Okay, so again, both the Stones and the Who and Led Zeppelin and so many other bands in the 70s take what the blues is, but go off in different directions. Okay, Led Zeppelin really, like Black Sabbath, moving on into heavier waters, but Sabbath's a different heavy from Zeppelin. All right, you can hear more of the blues heaviness than you do in you don't hear as much as that bluesy heaviness later on in Sabbath's discography as much. It's still there, but you don't hear it as much as you say here on the first 2 or 3 albums, or first 2 albums, and then there's some of that's also in the Dio era. But anyway, When you compare Zeppelin to the Stones and the Who and the Kinks, etc. combined, Zeppelin's the heaviest. Uriah Heep. One of proto metal's finest, including Sabbath, Purple, Heap, etc. All right, so let's get out of the way two bands that Led Zeppelin inspired and two bands I don't like, Greta Van Fleet and Kingdom Come. Two derivative of Zeppelin, if you ask me. Here are other bands. Guns N' Roses, specifically Axl Rose. We hear in Welcome to the Jungle that na-na-na-na part that we hear in Nobody's Fault But Mine. That definitely spills into Welcome to the Jungle. You know, the video's got his hair spiked, and when he says the word need, when Axl says the word need, and he says the repetition of the N, which I can't do very well, that definitely comes from Nobody's Fault But Mine. Inspiring Heart. You know, Heart goes on to do cover songs of Led Zeppelin after Bonham dies. But let's face it, the Wilson sisters saw joy in their eyes, or their eyes lit up like Christmas trees when they heard and saw Led Zeppelin, and they were so inspired by it. Queen were inspired by Led Zeppelin to some degree. Zebra, New Orleans' own band. Randy Jackson is going on record saying that his two favorite bands of all time are the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. You can hear it, especially in that first album. You have the beautiful harmonies that you get from the Beatles combined with the heaviness and the falsetto of Randy Jackson's voice mimicking Robert Plant, but in a good way. So you definitely hear it there. Whitesnake, because of Slide It In and Slip of the Tongue and Whitesnake 87. Metallica, definitely. Red Hot Chili Peppers, Audio Slave, Alice Cooper, Wolf Mother, Jack White, Queens of the Stone Age, Tame Impala, Mars Volta, Gary Clark Jr., the Black Keys. Now, let's talk about drums. Bonham's triplets, the speed and grace in which he played those triplets and everything, the energy that he had. Bonham, my second favorite drummer of all time behind Pert. Once Bonham was my favorite, but Bonham, just an amazing drummer. John Paul Jones, the Renaissance man, playing keys, synthesizers, the mandolin, the bass guitar. He's the heartbeat of the band. One of the best musicians ever, bass player or not a bass player, just overall because of that Renaissance factor. Plant, vocal range in his youth with the band, just amazing. The male Janis Joplin at times. Jimmy Page, influencing the following guitar players: Alex Lifeson, Ace Frehley, Van Halen, Satriani, Frusciante, Kirk Hammett, Richie Sambora, Slash, Dave Mustaine, Mick Mars, and Steve Vai. Page taking blues bass guitar and making it so heavy. Think of, and very Hendrix-like in Led Zeppelin 2 with the guitar solo in Heartbreaker. It sounds so much like, first time I heard that solo, I heard it out of context because I didn't hear the rest of the song yet. I turned on the radio one day and I'm hearing this. Is that Hendrix? So Jimmy Page, what else can you say about him? Well, here we go. Light and Shade, that story I told you that we've heard so many times. The double neck guitar, Stairway to Heaven, right? Led Zeppelin as a whole with all four members, so diverse, like Rush with their types of songs: folk, acoustic rock, blues, heavy blues rock, heavy blues, proto-metal blues, blues metal, whatever you want to call it. Prog, No Quarter, Carousel Alhambra, right? Epic tracks, Achilles' Last Stand, In My Time of Dying, Kashmir, right? Carousel Alhambra again, No Quarter again. Country, Hot Dog. Basic rock, rock and roll, Black Dog. The ballad, All My Love, Down by the Seaside, 10 Years Gone. Punk, Wearing and Tearing. Eastern influences, Kashmir, the connection to the Beatles and Rush. Okay, so Led Zeppelin number 2. Finally, number 1, the Beatles. They pioneered new recording techniques. Backwards guitar solos, instruments slowed or sped up, overdubs, soundscapes, odd timbres, psychedelic, proggy at times because of things like Sgt. Pepper's, a touch of proto-metal because of heavy songs like Helter Skelter, I Want You, She's So Heavy, and Come Together, although that's not heavy, but inspiring bands like Aerosmith to cover that. There are other examples of some heavy stuff from the band. Pop, of course. Light and Shade. Led Zeppelin didn't do Light and Shade first. You could argue the Beatles did. Or argue that when it comes to British bands in the 70s and 60s, Beatles did it first. Other examples of innovation: close miking instruments, padding on drums, vocal double tracking, using the speaker as a transducer. Okay. They took what came before them, pop, they made it edgy, even if not hard or heavy, like Helter Skelter. But there's a certain grit to even songs like Help. It's pop and it's jangly, but you still have there's this an underlying grit there in small spurts, if you will, or foreshadowing that edginess to come, if not edgy itself. Okay, love songs, some of the best, right? Please Please Me, I think, is a fabulous album. There's some wonderful love songs there. Inspiring, perhaps, and definitely inspiring David Coverdale of Whitesnake. In Whitesnake's first album, Trouble, you have them doing a Beatles cover. I forget, I can't think of it off the top of my head. McCartney and Lennon, the best duo when it comes to songwriting. And McCartney was always the one to push the band when he was a workaholic, for good or for ill. It's going on record, Paul McCartney and the other members of the band said that if it wasn't for Paul, for good or bad, there were times when they wanted to kill him because he kept pushing them to do another album, and they didn't want to. And, of course, you have George Martin. You have the wonderful Eastern influences of George Harrison, right? George Harrison, midway through his career with the Beatles, really pushing boundaries and pushing and influencing in the sense of getting his work, his songs that he's writing, to be Beatles songs. Not fully 100%, because some of those go on to be on All Things Must Pass, but definitely George coming into his own, growing as a singer-songwriter and musician when it comes to playing and writing. Some amazing guitar work from George. Of course, My Guitar Gently Weeps comes to mind. George Martin being the fifth Beatle, as so many people have pointed out. In addition, you have all four members of the band as vocalists. The first band to do that, I think, perhaps inspiring Kiss to do the same. Ace Frehley hesitant at first, but, and then, of course, having his own band where he sings all the time. So Beatles and Kiss have that connection with merchandise, two biggest merchandising bands of all time, and all four vocalists, all four members of the band sing, and perhaps the Beatles inspiring other bands to have more than one member of the band sing, like Blue Oyster Cult comes to mind, etc. Here are some bands the Beatles inspired. Zebra, I've talked about that already. Oasis, that's obvious. Kiss, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, Badfinger, Bee Gees, Flaming Lips, ELO, Nirvana, Dave Grohl, the Foo Fighters. Listen to The Great Pretender by the Foo Fighters. You have that. Not only you have that light and shade, but you have that Beatle-esque, the light part rather, is that Beatle-esque harmony that's so beautiful, and then it gets heavy, and then it gets light again, and it gets heavy. Wonderful. Cheap Trick, we all know Cheap Trick was inspired. You hear that often in the harmonies. You hear that Cheap Trick, you hear that Beatle-esqueness, if you will, in so many early Cheap Trick songs from, say, the second album through and including Next Position, Please. Anyway, King Crimson, you hear that, you hear a Beatle-esqueness, if you will, on the song Ladies of the Road on the Islands album, and Ozzy himself was influenced by the song She Loves You. And when it comes to, if we go back to all four members of the band singing tracks, Ringo not so much, but at times, when you have that, the idea of the frontman kind of goes bye-bye. Not totally, because let's face it, the two big frontmen are Paul and John, but it's kind of cool when you have all 4 members chiming in and singing and taking the lead. Anyway, so there you have it, folks. The Beatles is my number one. I think they're the most important band when it comes to, again, these 15 bands are about pioneers, innovation, inspiration, and influence. So please tell me what you think in the comments below. Take care. Have a blessed rest of your holiday season. Bye now.